The reflection in the viewport moved before I did. Just a fraction of a second. Just enough that I noticed. My hand was still rising to wipe the condensation from the glass when the reflection completed the motion, as though the other me had known what I intended before I did. I stood there for a long moment, my palm pressed against the cold surface, watching the shape that wore my face watch me back, with eyes that seemed to hold too much light. Let me tell you how it started. My name is Tobias Grail, third-grade technician of the Engineerium aboard the pilgrim vessel St. Alcuin's Promise. I had served on her for 11 years before the transit to Ophelia 7th. I knew every sound she made. The pulse of her plasma drives, the whisper of the recyclers, the deep thrumming of the Gellar generators that ran through the deck plates like a second heartbeat. I knew her the way you know your own body. She was home. The warp transit had been routine. 19 days out from Port Maw, bound for the Shrine World with 6,000 pilgrims above us. My world was the Engineerium, the maze of pipes and sacred machinery that kept us alive in the space between spaces. Each morning I walked the same corridor to the same workstation, past the Gellar indicator light mounted in the junction where the access corridor met the generator chamber. Green, always green. The color of safety, of reality maintained, of the thin bubble of sanity that separated us from what lay outside. We knew the normal strangeness of warp travel, the dreams that weren't quite dreams, the shadows that moved wrong in your peripheral vision. We knew to ignore the whispers from the walls during the deep watches, to pretend we didn't see the faces in the patterns of rust on the older pipes. This was simply what it meant to travel through the immaterium, the price of crossing the galaxy. Mira worked the station beside mine. 16 years together in the Engineerium, sharing meals and silences and the small rituals that made the void bearable. She had a daughter somewhere on Cadia, born before her conscription. She spoke of the girl sometimes, wondering what she looked like now. Mira kept a small Aquila pendant hidden beneath her coveralls, and I had seen her touch it when the ship groaned during translation. She had a habit of humming old Cadian hymns when she worked, melodies from a homeworld she barely remembered. I never told her, but I had learned them too. Some nights I caught myself humming along, and she would smile without looking up from her diagnostics. A small faith. A quiet one. We shared it. The first wrongness came on day 23. I noticed it at the morning meal. The corpse starch ration tasted different. Not spoiled, not wrong exactly, but different. Sweeter than it should have been, with an aftertaste that lingered on my tongue like copper. I mentioned it to Mira. She shrugged and said her portion tasted the same as always. I told myself I was imagining things. Warp sickness. It happened. The recycled air, the constant hum of the generators, the knowledge of what lay outside, it affected everyone eventually. I finished my ration and tried to forget, but I couldn't forget the shadow I saw on the way to my station. My shadow, cast by the lumen strips above, except that it had too many fingers. 7 on the left hand, 8 on the right. I stopped and stared at it, and when I looked at my own hands, they were normal. 5 fingers each, scarred from years of work, exactly as they had always been. When I looked back at the shadow, it was normal too. I stood there for a long time, flexing my fingers, watching the shadow flex with me, counting over and over until Mira came up behind me and asked what I was doing. The announcement came at shift change, a crackle of static, then Vox Officer Kell's voice, calm and measured. Attention all crew, minor Gellar fluctuation detected at Aero 347 hours. Field integrity has been restored. Resume normal duties. The Emperor, protects. Minor fluctuation. I had heard those words before, on other transits. They meant nothing, a momentary hiccup in the massive machines that kept us safe. The tech priests would be running their diagnostics, speaking their prayers to the generator spirits, applying the sacred oils, and adjusting the calibration runes. Nothing to concern us. Nothing unusual. I walked past the Gellar indicator on my way to my station. Green. Still green. But I stopped anyway, staring at it, watching for the flicker that would mean something else. The light remained steady. I moved on. That night, Mira used a phrase she had never used before. We were discussing the fluctuation, speaking in low voices in the mess hall, and she said, "The field always holds. It has to. Otherwise, they get through." They. She had never called them that before. She had never acknowledged them at all, not directly. When I asked her what she meant, she looked at me strangely and said she didn't know what I was talking about. She hadn't said anything. I didn't sleep well that cycle. When I did sleep, I dreamed of corridors that went on forever, and a sound like laughter coming from somewhere I couldn't find. The second fluctuation came on day 25. This time, the alarms woke us. The sound cut through everything. A rising howl that seemed to vibrate in my teeth, in my bones, in the parts of me that weren't quite physical. I was out of my bunk and running before I was fully awake, my feet carrying me toward the engineerium through corridors that seemed too long, too narrow, too full of shadows that pressed in from all sides. Other crew ran with me. I saw their faces in the emergency lighting, red-tinged, afraid, human. The alarm stopped. The regular lumens flickered back on, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw a figure standing in the junction ahead of me. Tall, thin, made of angles that didn't connect properly. Where its face should have been, there was only a spiral of teeth, descending inward forever. Then I blinked, and it was gone, and there was only the empty corridor and the sound of my own breathing. I found Mira at her station, her hands moving over the diagnostic panels with practiced precision. The Gellar indicator was amber, not red, not failure, but not green either, not safe. "Field integrity at 83%, she said without looking up. Fluctuation lasted 4.7 seconds. 4.7 seconds. Less than a heartbeat. But I had seen what I had seen. Reports came in through the Vox. Incidents in the lower decks. A rating who had attacked his bunkmate with a welding torch, screaming that he had seen the other man's true face. A pilgrim who had walked into an airlock and tried to cycle it open, saying she needed to see the light outside. A servitor that had stopped mid-task and begun reciting coordinates, numbers that corresponded to nothing in the navigational charts, numbers that seemed to burn when you tried to write them down. The chaplain held a service in the main chapel, standing room only. The pilgrims pressed together, their voices rising in the familiar litanies, the words of protection and faith that had sustained humanity for 10,000 years. I stood at the back and tried to pray with them. The words felt thin in my mouth, hollow, as though something was listening and finding them amusing. Senior Technician Varys found me after the service. He was old, older than anyone else in the engineerium, his face a map of scars and augmetic repairs. He had been serving aboard ship since before my father was born. He had survived things he rarely spoke of. When he took my arm and led me to an empty corridor, his grip was stronger than I expected. "You've seen something," he said. It wasn't a question. I told him about the reflection, the shadow, the thing in the corridor. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. When the field flickers, things look in. They press against the bubble of reality we carry with us, and they search for ways through. Most of them can't find one. The field holds them out, and when it stabilizes, they fall back into the nothing they came from. But some of them are patient. Some of them have been waiting a very long time, and some of them don't need to come through entirely. They just need a crack, a moment of connection, a mind that sees them clearly enough to give them shape. I asked him what he meant. "You saw something," he said. "That means something saw you, and now it knows you're there. It knows the shape of your thoughts, the flavor of your fear. If the field fails again, it will look for you specifically. It will call to you in voices you recognize. It will show you things you want to see. And if you listen, if you look too long, it won't matter if the field comes back online. It will already have a piece of you." I asked him how he knew. His hand went to his chest, where I knew the augmetic heart clicked and whirred beneath his robes. "Because I listened once, 40 years ago, on a different ship. The field failed for 19 seconds, and I heard my mother's voice calling me from a corridor that wasn't there. I followed it. I almost reached the door she was standing behind. And when the field came back, I was standing at an exterior hatch with my hand on the emergency release, and my heart had stopped beating from the things I had seen through the porthole. He showed me the scars then, the ones that weren't from accidents or repairs, the ones that formed shapes, almost like letters, almost like words in a language that predated human speech. "They're still there," he said. "Whatever touched me, whatever looked at me through that porthole, it's still there in the marks it left. Sometimes I can feel it moving beneath my skin, but it can't get through. Not as long as I don't listen, not as long as I don't look." I asked him what I should do. "Pray," he said, "not because anyone is listening. Pray, because the act of praying reminds you who you are, reminds you what is real. The moment you forget that, the moment you let them define reality for you, you're already lost." Day 26 brought the incidents we couldn't explain away. A servitor in the engine corps stopped mid-repair and began speaking, not in the monotone drone of programmed responses, but in a voice, a human voice, pleading, begging someone to let them out, to stop the pain that had ended decades ago when their personality was scrubbed away. The tech priests shut it down with sanctified promethium, but not before 3 ratings had heard enough to understand what they were really working alongside. 2 of them walked into the recycling systems before the shift ended. The third began laughing and didn't stop until his throat gave out. In the passenger decks, the pilgrims were dying. Not from violence, though there was violence, but from something else. Some of them simply stopped. Stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped breathing. They stood or sat wherever they had been when it took them, their eyes open, their mouths shaping words that made no sound. The chaplain called it holy ecstasy, said they had seen the emperor's light and been taken into his grace. But I saw the bodies when they were brought to the mortuarium. I saw the expressions frozen on their faces. That wasn't ecstasy. That was terror. Pure, absolute terror locked into flesh that had forgotten how to die. The smell in the lower decks changed. It had always been bad down there. The accumulated centuries of bilge and recycled air and the organic decay that no amount of maintenance could eliminate. But now it was different. sweeter, thicker. It coated the inside of your mouth when you breathed, left a taste on your tongue like overripe fruit mixed with copper and raw meat. A scent that made you salivate despite your revulsion. A hunger that had nothing to do with food. I stopped eating on day 26. I couldn't. Every time I looked at the corpse starch rations, I saw them differently. Saw what they really were, where the protein came from, the efficiency of imperial recycling taken to its logical conclusion. I told myself it was paranoia, warp sickness, the same thing affecting everyone else. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't seeing things wrong. I was seeing them clearly for the first time. And that clarity was a gift from something that wanted me to understand just how fragile the walls of my reality really were. Day 27. The field failed for 11 seconds. I was in my bunk when it happened, caught in a dream that wasn't a dream. I was walking through the ship, but the ship was wrong. The corridors were too wide, the walls were breathing, and everywhere I went I could hear singing. Beautiful singing. Harmonies that no human throat could produce, voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I followed the sound. I couldn't help it. The melody was the one Mira hummed at her station, but perfected, expanded into something that made my chest ache with longing. I knew with terrible certainty that if I found its source, I would understand everything, all the questions I had ever asked. All the fears I had ever felt, gone, answered, resolved. I woke to screaming. The emergency lights were flickering, casting everything in stuttering red shadows. The screaming was coming from somewhere close, somewhere inside the walls, somewhere inside my own skull. I couldn't tell which. I stumbled out of my bunk and into a corridor that had changed. The walls were slick with something that looked like condensation but felt warm to the touch. The smell was wrong, sweet and rotten at the same time, like fruit left to decay in a closed room. I found Mira in the mess hall. She was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by other crew, all of them keeping their distance. She was speaking, but not in her voice. In many voices. Layered on top of each other, male and female and things that were neither, all saying the same words at the same time. I can see it now, Tobias. I can see everything. The walls of the world are so thin here, so easy to look through. Don't you want to see? Don't you want to understand? I spoke her name, the name of the woman who had worked beside me for 16 years. The name of the woman who touched the Aquila beneath her coveralls when she was afraid. Her head turned toward me, and her eyes were full of light that shouldn't exist, light that hurt to look at, light that made promises I couldn't understand but wanted desperately to accept. For just a moment, the light flickered, and behind it, I saw Mira, the real Mira. Her face contorted in terror, her mouth forming words I couldn't hear, her hand reaching toward me before the light swallowed her again. Mira, I said again. Mira, listen to me. You have to fight this. You have to fight? All those voices laughing together. Why would I fight? I've never felt so free. The lies they told us, Tobias, the prayers, the faith, the devotion, all of it just noise to drown out the truth. But I can hear it now. I can hear what's really there behind everything, and it's beautiful. It's so beautiful. Senior Technician Varys appeared beside me. He was holding a shock maul, the kind used to discipline ratings who fell out of line. His face was hard, set in lines of terrible duty. She's gone, he said. Whatever's speaking through her, it's not your friend anymore. I wanted to argue. I wanted to believe that somewhere inside that thing wearing Mira's face, the real Mira was still there, still fighting. But I had heard the truth in those voices. Whatever had touched her during the 11 seconds of failure, it hadn't just looked inside her. It had moved in. It had taken up residence. And the woman I had known was now just a mask it wore. The chaplain came with armed ratings. They took her away. I don't know what happened to her after that. I don't want to know. But I saw the chaplain's face as they dragged her past him, and I saw the way his hands trembled as he made the sign of the Aquila. He knew. We all knew. The field was failing, and each time it failed, more of them got through. The next 3 days blurred together, fragments, images, sounds. The sequence is wrong in my memory, the order jumbled, as though time itself had become unreliable within the ship's hull. I found a corridor that hadn't existed the day before, stretching away into darkness that swallowed the light from my lumen. I walked down it for what felt like hours before realizing I hadn't moved at all, that I was still standing at the entrance, that something had been walking inside my mind while my body stayed frozen. The walls spoke my name. They spoke secrets I had never told anyone. They spoke the prayer I had said at my mother's deathbed 40 years before. I remember the children. The pilgrims had brought children, dozens of them, families on pilgrimage to the shrine world, seeking blessings for their young. I hadn't thought about them before. They were passengers, separated from us by decks and duties, irrelevant to my work in the engineerium. But on day 29, I heard them singing, rising up through the deck plates, filtering through the ventilation systems, a chorus of young voices lifted in perfect harmony. The song was beautiful, achingly beautiful, and completely wrong. No imperial hymn used those intervals. No human composer would arrange those harmonies. The children were singing something that predated humanity, something that had been waiting in the warp for minds young enough and innocent enough to receive it clearly. The singing stopped when the chaplain reached them. I don't know what he found in that compartment. I don't know what he had to do, but when he emerged, his robes were wet, with something darker than blood, and his hands shook so badly he couldn't make the sign of the Aquila for 3 days afterward. Day 30. I stopped counting after that. The ship changed. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean the ship itself became different. Corridors that had been straight for 300 years now curved in directions that hurt to follow. Rooms that should have been empty contained things that watched from corners that shouldn't exist. The walls in the lower decks had begun to pulse, a slow rhythm that matched no mechanical heartbeat, and when you pressed your ear against them, you could hear voices speaking in languages that predated humanity. Worse, you could almost understand them. The meaning hovered just at the edge of comprehension, and some part of you wanted desperately to lean closer, to listen harder, to finally grasp what they were saying. I found crew members standing at walls, their ears pressed to the metal, their eyes closed, their faces peaceful. They didn't respond when I called their names. They didn't move when I shook them. They just listened, drinking in whatever was being whispered to them. And when I came back hours later to check on them, they were gone. Not dead, not transformed, just gone. As though they had heard something that called them somewhere else, and they had followed. We sealed the lower decks. We sealed the passenger sections. The pilgrims were screaming or praying or singing songs that none of them should know. We stopped responding to their vox calls. There was nothing we could do for them. There was barely anything we could do for ourselves. The Gellar generator was dying. The tech priests had gathered around it. their mechadendrites waving in patterns of desperate prayer. But even I could see the truth. The psyker who powered the field, the poor soul wired into the heart of the machine, was failing, burned out, used up by the constant pressure of holding back the immaterium. His body was still alive, technically, but his mind was gone, consumed by the very forces he had spent his life containing. Without him, the field couldn't hold. Without the field, we were dead, or worse than dead. Navigator Tertius called a council in the command spire. Those of us who remained, those who still wore our own faces, gathered in the strategium and listened as he explained our options. His voice was calm, but I could see the third eye beneath his bandana, pressed against the fabric, straining towards something none of us could see. "We can attempt emergency translation," he said. "Drop from the warp immediately, wherever we are. The chances of survival—" He paused, his bandaged eye twitching beneath the fabric. "The warp does not obey probability. I cannot calculate odds where mathematics breaks down. But I have done this once before. 1 ship in 3 survived. We may emerge inside a star or in the void between galaxies, or in a place where the walls of reality are even thinner than here. But we will be out of the warp." Someone asked about the other 70%. "We will not survive," Tertius said simply. "The translation will tear the ship apart, or we will emerge into something worse than what we face now." Another option. Someone else could power the field. The tech priests had identified 3 crew members with latent psychic potential, people who had hidden their gifts their entire lives to avoid the black ships. One of them could be wired into the generator. Their soul could burn in place of the dead psyker, long enough for us to complete the transit. I looked at the faces in the room. I saw the fear there, the desperate calculation. Who among us would be chosen to die? And then I understood. This was the choice. This was always the choice in the Imperium. Someone had to suffer so that others could live. Someone had to burn so that the light could continue. The God Emperor himself had made that choice 10,000 years ago, and every day since, 1,000 psykers had followed him into agony so that humanity could survive. I thought of Mira, of the thing wearing her face, of the voices that had spoken through her about beauty and freedom and truth. I thought of Senior Technician Varys and the scars that moved beneath his skin. I thought of the singing I had heard in my dream, the harmonies that promised understanding if I only surrendered. I volunteered. I don't know why. Even now, decades later, I cannot explain the impulse that moved me. Perhaps it was faith, real faith, rising up from depths I hadn't known I possessed. Perhaps it was exhaustion, the desperate need to stop waiting for the end and do something, anything, to change the equation. Perhaps it was Mira. Perhaps some part of me believed that if I could hold the field, could keep the warp at bay long enough for us to escape, then somehow I could undo what had happened to her, as though burning my own soul could redeem hers. Or perhaps a voice I couldn't quite hear whispered to me in that moment, a voice that wanted me in that machine for reasons I still don't understand. I stepped forward. I said the words. I saw the relief on their faces, the shame they tried to hide beneath gratitude, and I felt nothing but a strange, cold peace. The kind of peace that comes when you've made a decision that cannot be unmade, when the future narrows to a single point and all the other possibilities fall away like dead leaves. The tech priests took me to the generator chamber. I had walked past this place 1,000 times, but I had never truly seen it until now. The chamber was vast. far larger than the ship's schematics suggested, as though it existed partially in some other space. The generator itself rose from the deck like a cathedral in miniature, all spires and cables and crystalline structures that hummed with frequencies just below hearing. At its heart, suspended in a web of wires and tubes and glistening nerve fiber, was what remained of the previous psyker, a husk, a shell, the meat left over when the soul has been burned away. They would wire me into his place. The Magos who led the rite was ancient, more machine than man, his voice a synthesized drone that carried no emotion. But I saw the way his optical implants dimmed when he looked at me. I saw the way his mechadendrites trembled as they prepared the sacred instruments. He knew what they were about to do. He knew it was monstrous. And he was going to do it anyway, because the alternative was worse. This procedure has never been successfully completed, he said, his voxcaster crackling. The untrained mind cannot sustain field coherence. You will burn. The only question is whether you burn long enough. He paused, and something almost like pity flickered across his augmetic features. Do you understand what you are offering? I told him I understood. They spoke the rites of preparation, words in a language I didn't recognize, syllables that seemed to vibrate in frequencies the human ear wasn't designed to perceive. They painted my skin with sacred oils that burned wherever they touched, leaving trails of silver fire that sank beneath my flesh and spread through my veins like mercury. They carved circuit patterns into my arms and chest with blades that were sharper than any metal, and when the blood flowed, it came out wrong, darker, thicker, as though what was inside me was already changing to accommodate what it would need to become. And then they opened me up, piece by piece, and wired what was left into the machine. I cannot describe what I felt when the field activated through me. There are no words for it in any human language. The warp pressed against my mind, and I felt every demon, every entity, every hungry intelligence that had been circling us for 30 days. They screamed, they raged, they promised and threatened and begged. And I held them out, not with faith, not with strength, but with the simple, stubborn refusal to let them through, the same stubbornness that had kept me alive in the engineerium for 11 years, the same small, quiet will that made me get up every morning and walk to my station and do my work. The ship emerged from the warp 3 days later. I know this because they told me afterward. I don't remember any of it. I don't remember holding the field, or fighting the things that pressed against it, or the moment when the real space opened around us and the pressure finally stopped. I just remember waking up in the medici bay, my body wrapped in bandages, my mind filled with echoes of voices that still whisper sometimes when I'm almost asleep. They tell me I was in the generator for 73 hours. They tell me I should be dead. They tell me the Inquisition has questions about how I survived, about what I might have done or become during those hours of contact with the immaterium. I tell them I don't remember. It's not entirely true. I remember some things, fragments, images. That might be memories, or might be dreams, or might be something else entirely. I remember a light that wasn't light. I remember a voice that sounded like everyone I had ever loved speaking in unison. I remember a choice that felt like falling and flying at the same time. I remember something showing me the shape of the universe, the pattern behind all patterns, the truth that underlies all truths. And I remember choosing not to look. Choosing to close whatever passed for eyes in that moment and hold on to the small, stubborn kernel of self that refused to be enlightened. I remember the things that pressed against the field, pressing against me. Thousands of them, millions. Intelligences vast and ancient and hungry, drawn to the light of human souls like moths to a flame. They spoke to me in every voice I had ever known. They offered me everything I had ever wanted. They showed me Mira, the real Mira, trapped somewhere inside the thing that wore her face, screaming for help that would never come. They told me I could save her. All I had to do was let go. I didn't let go, but mostly I remember holding on. That's what I tell the interrogators when they come with their questions and their suspicion and their careful tests for corruption. I held on. That's all. That's everything. The St. Alcuin's promise was decommissioned after we reached port. The damage was too extensive, they said. The contamination too deep. The tech priests who examined her afterward found things that shouldn't have been there. Organic material fused with the hull plating. Growths in the lower decks that pulsed with life, even after weeks without atmosphere. A chamber in the deep bilges where the walls had turned to flesh, and a shape had been growing in the center of it. A thing with too many limbs and mouths that opened sideways. It had been feeding on the passengers who disappeared during those final days. It had almost been ready to be born. They scoured her with blessed fire and broke her bones into scrap, and somewhere in that pyre was everything I had known for 11 years. My station, my quarters, the corridor where I had seen the thing with too many angles, the mess hall where Mira had spoken with voices that weren't hers, the Gellar indicator that had watched over us, green and amber and red, and finally dark, the light that measured the distance between safety and annihilation. I still pray sometimes, not because I believe anyone is listening, but because the act of praying reminds me who I am, who I was before the transit, who I might still be if the voices in my head are just echoes and not something else. The Gellar light was green when we emerged. They told me that. Green and steady and stable. The field held. We survived. That's the official record. That's what the historians will write. But I know what came through during those failing seconds. I know that some of the crew who walked off that ship weren't the same people who had walked on. And I know that whatever touched me during those 73 hours in the generator, whatever I saw and heard and held at bay, some part of it is still there, still waiting, still watching from behind my eyes, through the cracks in my mind that will never quite seal. The field held. That's what I tell them. I don't tell them about the dreams, about the singing that calls to me from corridors that don't exist, about the reflection in the viewport that moved a fraction of a second before I did. The Emperor protects. I no longer know what that means.